In 2016, I got robbed. And oddly enough, that moment ended up being the beginning of my financial awakening because right after that happened, I did something I had been avoiding for years. I sat down and looked at my entire financial life, every balance, every payment, every credit card, and what I saw surprised me. Not just because I had about $95,000 in debt, but because I realized something deeper. My finances weren't chaotic, they were just unexamined. That moment of awareness is what started a journey that would take me 2.5 years to completely change my financial life and eventually led me to start creating financial education content. I'm Angie, and this is the story of how I ended up creating financial education content, not because I set out to become a finance educator, not because I always had everything figured out, but because there was a moment in my life where I realized something had to change. And that moment came in 2016 when I got robbed. Now, when people hear that, they usually imagine something dramatic, but what it really did was force me to see my life differently because sometimes it's not the event itself that changes you, it's what the event reveals. And what that moment revealed to me was how unaware I had been about my own financial life. There was a time when I avoided looking at my bank account, not because I didn't know what was in there, but because I already knew how it would feel heavy, tight, like no matter how much effort I was putting into life, I wasn't really getting ahead. Bills were paid, technically. Life looked normal on the outside. I was going to work, handling responsibilities, doing what adults are supposed to do. But underneath that, there was this quiet pressure, a pressure that didn't show up in photos, a pressure that didn't show up in conversations, but it was there. Like I was always one unexpected decision away from things slipping. And at one point, that pressure had a number attached to it, about $95,000. That's about how much debt I was carrying. Now, when people hear a number like that, the first reaction is usually shock. How did it get that high? But that question misses something important because most debt doesn't show up all at once. It doesn't arrive like a storm and it builds slowly, quietly over time. A credit card here, a loan there, student loans, a car payment that seemed reasonable at the time, a balance you fully plan to pay off soon. And before you realize it, you're not just managing money anymore, you're managing pressure. And that pressure becomes part of your normal life. It becomes something you adapt to, something you work around, it's something you tell yourself is temporary. And the truth is, when life keeps moving, it's very easy to normalize financial stress. You still go to work, you still show up for people, you still laugh, you still function. And because everything technically works, you convince yourself that things aren't that bad. You tell yourself you'll deal with it later when things calm down, when you make a little more, when you have more time. But later has a way of never arriving. And while you're waiting, interest is building, balances are growing, and your financial life is quietly getting heavier. For me, that heaviness had been building for years. But it wasn't until that moment in 2016, after I got robbed, that something shifted inside me because that experience forced me to slow down and take a real look at my life, not just emotionally, but financially. And I remember sitting down and looking at everything for the first time in a way that felt honest, every balance, every payment, every interest rate, every minimum payment, not in a judgmental way, but in an aware way. And that was the first time I realized something. I hadn't really been looking at my financial life clearly. I had been operating around it, working around it, avoiding the full picture. And avoidance has a way of keeping things frozen because when things are unclear, your brain fills in the gaps. And those gaps usually feel worse than reality. But once you see the numbers clearly, something changes. It becomes real. And when something becomes real, you can finally respond to it. Now, here's where things get interesting because when people hear that I paid off $95,000 in about 2.5 years, they often assume the story is about extreme discipline or cutting everything out or living on almost nothing. But that's not really what changed things because the hardest part wasn't the math, it was the mindset. It was learning how to stop living in reaction and start making decisions with intention. At the beginning, nothing felt urgent enough to change. That's something people don't talk about enough. You can be in a difficult financial situation and still function. still go to work, still take care of your family, still pay the bills, still show up. And because life keeps moving, you convince yourself that things are manageable. But manageable isn't the same as sustainable. And I remember realizing at one point that I wasn't actually moving forward. I was maintaining, keeping things from getting worse, but not making them better. And that realization is uncomfortable because it forces you to ask a different question. Not, can I survive this? But do I want to keep living like this? And when that question becomes real, things start to shift. The first real shift for me didn't come from a budgeting app. It didn't come from a financial guru. It came from awareness, from looking directly at the numbers, seeing the full picture, and deciding that I didn't want to keep operating the same way. Now, that decision didn't immediately change everything, but it changed how I approached money. Because once you become aware, you start noticing patterns. I started noticing where money was going without purpose, the small things, the repeated things, the things that didn't feel like a big deal individually, but added up over time. Subscriptions I forgot about, convenience spending, multiple minimum payments on credit cards, little lifestyle upgrades that made life feel easier in the moment but didn't really move my life forward. And I'm not saying those things are bad, they're normal, but when you're trying to change your financial direction, you have to understand what's actually moving the needle. Because progress doesn't come from one dramatic decision, it comes from patterns, from repeated choices, from consistency over time. There was also an emotional layer I had to confront because debt isn't just numbers. Debt is emotional. It's tied to how you see yourself. There's guilt, frustration, sometimes even a little shame. And if you don't acknowledge that emotional layer, it starts showing up in your behavior. You avoid looking at your accounts, you delay decisions, you tell yourself it's not the right time. But the truth is, there's never a perfect time. There's just a decision. And that decision doesn't have to be dramatic. It just has to be consistent. One of the biggest changes I made was shifting from reacting to planning. Before that, money felt like something that just happened. Bills came in, expenses appeared, life happened, and I adjusted. But when you live like that, you're always catching up, always responding, always slightly behind the next expense. So I started assigning my money before it moved, not in a restrictive way, but in a clear way. What needs to be covered, what needs to be reduced, what can go toward debt, even small amounts. Because consistency matters more than intensity. And this is something that doesn't get talked about enough. There were months where progress felt slow, really slow, where the balances barely moved, where it felt like all the effort wasn't adding up to much. And those are the moments where most people stop, not because they're lazy, not because they don't care, but because it doesn't feel like it's working. But what I started to understand is that progress doesn't always feel like progress in the moment, especially when you're paying down debt, because interest slows things down, because life still happens, because unexpected expenses don't pause just because you're trying to improve. So you have to zoom out and you have to look at the pattern, not just the moment, because over time, those small, consistent decisions start stacking month by month, balance by balance, and eventually something interesting happens. Momentum builds, what once felt slow starts moving faster. And when that shift happens, your confidence grows. There was also a shift in how I viewed income. Before that point, income felt like relief, like something that temporarily solved problems. But during this process, I started viewing income differently, not as something that should expand my lifestyle, but as something that could create margin. Any extra money, bonuses, side income, unexpected opportunities had a purpose, not to make life look bigger, but to make life feel lighter. And that doesn't mean I stopped enjoying life. It just means I became more intentional about timing. There's a difference between something you can afford and something that aligns with where you're going. And when you start making decisions based on direction instead of impulse, your entire relationship with money begins to shift. The real turning point in my journey wasn't when the debt number dropped dramatically. It was when my relationship with money changed, when I stopped feeling like I was constantly behind and started feeling like I was participating in my own financial life, not perfect control, but awareness, clarity, direction, enough to know what was happening, enough to trust my decisions, enough to believe I was moving somewhere different. Because once that shift happens, discipline becomes easier. You're not forcing yourself anymore. You're responding to a plan you believe in. And that belief is what carries you through the slower moments. Paying off $95,000 didn't happen in one dramatic push. It happened in phases, moments where things clicked, moments where things felt hard, moments where progress sped up, and moments where it felt like nothing was happening at all. But through all of that, the consistency stayed. And that's what made the difference. Looking back now, that experience didn't just change my finances, it changed how I saw the role of financial awareness in people's lives because I realized something. And there's so many people walking around carrying quiet financial pressure. They're responsible, they work hard, they take care of their families, but underneath it all, there's stress, there's uncertainty, and there's the feeling that they should be further ahead than they are. And most of the time, no one is really talking about it. That realization is what eventually led me to start creating financial education content, not because I had all the answers, but because I understood the journey and I understood the emotional side of money, the quiet pressure, the slow progress, the small decisions that eventually change everything. And I wanted to create content that felt honest, not extreme, not unrealistic, but practical. Because financial peace isn't built overnight, it's built decision by decision, month by month, habit by habit. If you're in a place right now where your finances feel heavy, the goal isn't to fix everything overnight. It's to create clarity. Start by understanding where you actually are, not where you hope to be, not where you think you should be, but where things stand right now. Because clarity reduces anxiety. Even when the numbers aren't perfect, then focus on direction, not speed. What are you moving toward? What are you reducing? What decisions support that? Keep it simple, keep it realistic, because the more complicated it feels, the harder it is to sustain. And sustainability is what creates change. Also, give yourself room to be human. There will be moments where you don't get it right, moments where you spend more than planned, moments where progress slows down. That doesn't undo everything, it's part of the process. What matters is that you keep returning to the plan, not perfectly, just consistently. Looking back now, paying off $95,000 wasn't just about becoming debt free, it was about becoming aware, about learning how to move through life with intention instead of reaction, about understanding that financial peace isn't something you arrive at overnight. It's something you build decision by decision, month by month. And if you're in the middle of your own journey right now, feeling like things are heavier than you'd like, you're not behind. You're just in a phase where things are becoming clearer, where patterns are being revealed, where decisions are starting to matter more. And that's where change begins. Not in perfection, not in speed, but in awareness. And once you have that, you're closer than you think, even if it doesn't feel like it yet.